Related to discussions of supply chain management and inventory management is the idea of closed loop supply chains. And the idea of closed loop supply chains has gained popularity over the last couple of years. So when we look at a closed loop supply chain, what we're doing is we are combining some of the ideas that we've talked about already in supply chain management. So we talked about forward logistics. So your supply chain consists of a factory, a distributor, a wholesaler, and a retailer. The factory makes the good, sends it to the distributor, distributor sends it to the wholesaler, wholesaler to the retailer, and on to the customer. So here we have forward logistics, the inventory, so from raw material to partially created product to final product is moving forward through the supply chain. At the same time, we have reverse logistics. So if there is a return of a defective product, it moves back up through the supply chain. Customer returns it to the retailer acts as a gatekeeper and determines how far up the supply chain it goes. If it's simply a matter of the customer returning the product because the shirt wasn't in their size, then the retailer can resell the product. If the TV they bought has stuck pixels or is broken in some way, then it may move further up the supply chain where it can be refurbished or repaired, or if it can't be, then where it can be scrapped for parts. So with a closed loop supply chain, we're going to incorporate both that forward logistics and the reverse logistics. And the key here with closed loop supply chain is we're managing forward logistics and reverse logistics over the entire life of the product. Okay. So then we need to consider, okay, well, what's the life cycle of a product? So we think back to marketing classes that we've taken, and we look at the life cycle of a product. So we have the brand new product that's released, and then we have growth as more people demand the product. And then there's a period of maturity. We've basically exhausted the market, saturated the market, and then we start to see a decline. And so products reach the end of life, right? So we call it EOL, the end of life. So the question is what do you do when a product reaches the end of life? So at end of life, the vendor no longer intends to sell the product anymore, and they may not even support the product anymore. So if we think about computers with old operating systems, at some point, Microsoft no longer will update the operating system, so they just move on to a newer version of the software, so there's no longer any updates or fixes. Same thing happens with product lines. Whether you're looking at TVs or computers, eventually we move on to a different model, different type, and we no longer maintain or want to continue selling the older version. So what do you do with a product when it ends its life? What you see here in the bottom right in terms of pictures is e-waste. Many countries have legislation on the end of life for products, especially for electronics or e-waste. For example, in the European Union, there's the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, and this requires the collection, recycling, and recovery of all electronic goods. So electronic goods can't go to the landfill. Companies that sell electronics have to get them back and then break them down and recycle the components. We have the same thing in Canada. So if we look at what's called EPR, which is Extended Producer Responsibilities for e-products. So when you buy an electronic so a phone, a computer, when you buy one in Canada, you're paying an eco fee. And this eco fee then is used to pay to dismantle electronics into recyclable components. And so what you see here, this is a graphic from Environment Canada, and it shows the different companies that are responsible for recycling and breaking down that e-waste. And so when you pay those eco fees, it's going to these companies. And that's why a disposal of e-waste is not going to the landfill. It's a separate bin, or you can take it to the company that you bought the product from. So let's look at why we might return products. So why would you bring a product back? Okay, so we have end-of-life returns, especially with electronics, where we don't want it to go to the landfill, so it goes back to the company to be broken down. We also have commercial returns. So with a commercial return, you buy a shirt, it doesn't fit, you return it in a couple days. Okay, that one goes right back to the retailer. If the product you buy is defective, right? If you have a TV that has a stuck pixel, you take it back to the company you bought it from. We also have end-of-use returns. So think about these as trade-ins, right? When you buy a new cell phone, when you upgrade to the next one, you often bring your other phone in, and either they will give you some trade-in value to it or they'll dispose of it for you. So sometimes we're just done using that product, and sometimes that product is no longer being supported by the company, so it's an end-of-life return as opposed to an end-of-use return. So regardless of why you return the product, it goes back into the supply chain. So if we combine the forward and reverse logistics, we get a closed-loop supply chain. So what we see here is here's the forward logistics that we had in our supply chain before. We take raw materials, we turn into a product, it goes to the distributor, the wholesaler, the retailer. Now we want to add in the reverse logistics, not just the returns for a defective product, but we want to take a look at all of the used product, whether it is returned because it's a commercial return, it's a t-shirt that didn't fit, or it's a defective product, or it's an end of use or end of life return. So let's look at how this works. As a retailer, you sell product to the customer. The customer, if it is a commercial return, will return it to the retailer. The retailer can then resell the t-shirt that didn't fit for you. If our return is for a defective product or an end of use or end of life, the customer returns it to the retailer, and the retailer then evaluates why it's being returned and what's wrong with it. Okay, so this is where the retailer is acting as the gatekeeper to determine what the appropriate use of this product is. Okay, so when they do the return evaluation, some things become waste and have to be disposed of. Others go to a recovery facility, which will then take care of that product. Maybe it is recycled into its components, so we break down a phone and we take out the metal. There are rare earth minerals that are in phones, and we can pull them out of old phones, and we can actually then use that mineral in new phones, so it can be recycled. And in fact, if we switch to our articles here, that's one thing that Apple is working on with their iPhones. So historically, they've had to dig for rare earth minerals, but there's a limited amount of them in the world, and the less there are, the more expensive they are. And if it's hard to access them, because we have to do strip mining, for example, then it gets more costly to get more. So what Apple is proposing is to close their supply chain by, instead of mining for additional minerals, what they will do is they will strip them out of their old phones, in which case, if we go back to our graphic, if we strip them out at a recovery facility, then those raw materials can be shipped to the factory and used to produce new phones. Now, we don't have to just strip it for components. When an item is returned, if an item is returned and it's simply because the customer didn't want it, but the retailer isn't able to get rid of it, then it can go back to the recovery facility and be remarketed to the distributor. So maybe we couldn't sell it as a new phone because the customer had it, but we could remarket it as something else. Okay, so maybe it's a promo that we're giving away, a phone, things like that. So it could be remarketed, or it could be refurbished. So perhaps the item is returned because there was something wrong with it, and all we had to do is pull out the motherboard and replace it. So a simple change out of a component fixed it. Maybe it's a TV and it was a bad cable. We replaced the cable and now the TV is great. So at the recovery facility, we can make this determination, small changes are made, and then that product can go right back into our supply chain and be sold. So it goes back to the distributor, onto the wholesaler, retailer, and so on. It's also possible that the product is defective and can't be easily repaired, and so it has to be remanufactured. So we go back to the factory and have it essentially be rebuilt. Okay, so little changes will be refurbished. Big changes where rebuilding the whole thing is remanufactured. If we can't fix it and resell it, then we have to strip it down to its parts and then use the components by using the recycled pieces to help cut the cost in our production. So the whole purpose here is to have a value-added supply chain. We talked before about the importance of value added in your forward logistics, right? Every part of your supply chain should add value to the customer. Okay? The same thing is true with the reverse logistics and the rest of your closed loop supply chain. So if you are refurbishing, remarketing, if you are pulling out components, so you're taking out the plastic and melting it down, you're taking out the minerals and reusing them, all of that must have value added. It can't simply be a waste stream, a way to throw things away. It needs to be value added to the supply chain and to the customer. So if you are pulling out, for example, rare earth minerals, then that should be cutting cost in your manufacturing because you don't have to then mine for them or pay outsource to get them. So all of these should be about saving money, adding value, making more money for the company. If you can refurbish or remanufacture, then that means that that item that you've produced doesn't just go and be disposed of where it made you no money. Instead, you can resell it and make some money off of it. So the idea here is to reclaim the loss, reduce the waste, and increase the value to the company. So when we look at our supply chains, we need to have a number of considerations. The first is it's a value chain, not a waste stream. So each part of that reverse logistic needs to be adding value to the company and to the customer. When companies look at closed loop supply chains, they're going to have to consider the opportunity cost of your time. So because as we go back to this chain here, we're going to have people at the retailer assess what is the issue with the product. It's going to have to go to a recovery facility that's going to determine the appropriate use of the product and where it's going to go. That all takes time, and time has a cost. And so that has to be considered as a company looks at its supply chain. We're managing the entire supply chain, and so we need to make sure that the time cost is not so costly that we're actually losing money, that it's more expensive to have to reuse these pieces of the product or resell some of the product than it would simply be to dispose of it. So we need to add value throughout. We need to consider the cost of time and recognize that the longer it takes to return the product to the market, the less valuable it will be. So as we look at this closed loop supply chain, if a customer returns the item and we can immediately resell it because it didn't take the tags off of it and it was simply because the shirt didn't fit, that has way more value than a shirt that's been used up, right? If we can resell the TV, that has way more value than a TV that has to be repaired. So the longer it takes to get back into our supply chain, our forward logistics, the less value it's going to have. If it's simply a matter of replacing the cord on a TV, okay, that's definitely going to be much more valuable to resell than it is if we actually have to take apart the television and rebuild some inner components. And that has way more value than if we have to take the TV, open it up, melt down the plastic, pull out the metal, and only use components of it or pieces of it. And if we're using those pieces as raw materials, they definitely have less value than a finished product. So the longer it takes for it to get back to the forward supply chain, the less value it's going to have. Products that have very short life cycles have a much higher obsolescence risk. So when we think about a phone, for example, when it comes to a phone, people don't want, 5-year-old phones. So their life cycle in terms of a growth, maturity, and then decline is very rapid. Lots of technology has very short life cycles. When we talk about obsolescence risk, we're talking about the point at which nobody wants it anymore. So it has no value for sale because it's undesirable. Well, if your product has a short life cycle, then it's going to reach that undesirable point very quickly, which means when we look at the supply chain, remember, the longer it takes to get back into the chain, the less value it has. Well, when it comes to returning a phone, for example, only for a very short time can you make money off of refurbished phones. After a couple months, people have moved on to the newer version and they would much rather have the newer version, a refurbished version of the newer version than a refurbished version of the older version. So then it quickly comes down to this category here where it's just being recycled for its components, which has a lot less value to the company. When we look at the closed loop supply chain, we have to manage all of it like a supply chain, which means we need to come up with some key performance indicators. Okay. So you'll remember last week we discussed the key performance indicators for supply chain management. So you need to look at your inventory turnover rate, you need to look at the level of quality, and so the same key performance indicators that we had with the supply chain are true with the rest of the closed loop supply chain as well. So not only forward logistics, but with reverse logistics as well. So we have to make sure that we have some key performance indicators. We need to check how we're doing performance-wise. We need to focus on communication throughout our supply chain, not just the forward supply chain, but the reverse as well. And so those same things we talked about last week in terms of managing your supply chain, you're now managing with all of these new components as well.